You are one sleep cycle away from changing the way money responds to your life. There is a strange pattern that very few people notice, and it quietly decides who struggles and who starts receiving unexpected financial flow without forcing anything. This is not about luck, and it is not about hard work alone. Something deeper is always moving underneath what you see on the surface, and most people never question it because they are too busy surviving the same cycle every day. This message is for the person who feels stuck even after trying everything. The person who wakes up with the same thoughts, the same pressure, and the same unanswered questions sitting in the mind again and again. Why does nothing change even when effort is there? Why does money feel like it arrives for others but avoids certain lives completely? There is a method that works quietly during sleep, when the mind is not resisting, not analyzing, and not fighting reality. During that state, something powerful begins to shift inside human awareness, not instantly in the outer world, but first in the internal frequency that shapes what is allowed to enter life. And when that frequency changes, reality has no choice but to respond. But before understanding that fully, there is something uncomfortable that must be said. Most people will never hear this, not because it is hidden, but because they stop too soon. There is a reason some nights feel heavy and restless, even without a clear cause. There is a reason certain thoughts repeat right before sleep, almost like they are being placed there on purpose. And there is a reason financial struggle often feels emotional first before it becomes physical. There is a retention hook here that must be understood before anything else is accepted. Stay with this, because what comes next will completely change the way sleep is used from this night onward. Most people assume money is controlled only by action. That belief is incomplete. There is another layer operating silently, and it is influenced most when the body is asleep and the conscious mind is no longer interfering. This is where suggestion becomes programming, and programming slowly becomes reality. And here is the pattern interrupt that changes everything for many people the moment they hear it. Most people will never hear this. Not because it is hidden, but because they stop too soon. This is not about forcing belief. It is about noticing what has been ignored for too long. If sleep is the most powerful reset state of the human system, then what is being placed into that state every single night begins to matter more than anything spoken during the day. There is a reason this method was used for 9 nights in a row. And there is a reason the results did not appear the way most people expect them to appear. The shift was not loud. It was not dramatic at first, but it was undeniable. And if there is even a small curiosity forming right now, then stay connected to this moment, because the next part reveals what actually changes inside the mind when sleep is used as a vibration tool instead of just rest. Welcome to the channel. And if this message already feels like it is speaking directly to something unspoken inside, then subscribe and stay with this journey. Because what unfolds next is not common knowledge, but it can quietly change everything about the way money begins to flow into a life. It started with something so unusual that it almost felt like a joke at first. A simple idea that claimed you could influence money flow by changing your state of mind right before sleep. Not through effort, not through action, but through vibration during the final moments of awareness before drifting into sleep. At first it sounded too simple to be real. Almost insulting to everything most people believe about success. Because the mind is trained to trust struggle more than simplicity. If something is easy, it is usually dismissed. If something feels invisible, it is usually ignored. That is how most people miss things that actually work. Do not skip this part, because this is where most people make the biggest mistake. They hear something unusual and instantly reject it instead of sitting with it long enough to understand it. The idea was called a sleep vibration method. The concept was not about chanting or forcing belief. It was about gently guiding emotional frequency while the mind is slipping into the most suggestible state of the entire day. Right before sleep, the brain naturally shifts into theta waves, a state where thoughts become deeply absorbable. In this state, the subconscious does not question, it records. There is a lesser-known fact that makes this even more interesting. Studies in neuroscience have shown that the subconscious mind can process and store information during the transition into sleep, even when conscious attention is fading. This means the final emotional state before sleep can act like a repeated instruction to the inner mind, shaping patterns without resistance. But knowing that did not remove doubt. If anything, it made it more confusing. Because if something this simple actually worked, why was nobody talking about it in a serious way? Why was it not everywhere? Why were people still struggling if the answer was this close? That is where curiosity started to turn into something heavier. Not belief, not confidence, but a strange pull to test it anyway. Because sometimes life reaches a point where logic stops helping, and curiosity becomes stronger than skepticism. There was nothing to lose anymore. That was the honest truth behind the decision. Not faith, not certainty, just quiet desperation mixed with a small hope that maybe something different could finally break the cycle that kept repeating every single month. And that is when the first night began, without any expectation of change, only the willingness to try something unusual just to see if anything at all would shift. And what I am about to share next, nobody talks about this, but it changes everything. There is something most people never realize, and it quietly controls their entire financial reality without ever being noticed. It is not just about skills, timing, or opportunities. There is an emotional frequency attached to money itself, and most people are unconsciously tuned to repel it instead of receive it. Do not skip this part, because this is where most people make the biggest mistake. They focus on chasing money while unknowingly carrying emotions that push it away at the same time. Fear is one of the strongest hidden blocks. Not obvious fear, but subtle fear of losing money, fear of not having enough, fear of repeating past failure. Stress follows closely behind it. When the mind is constantly tense around survival, it creates a signal that says lack is normal here. And resistance appears when abundance is imagined but not fully felt as safe. Here is a lesser-known fact that changes how this is understood. Research in psychophysiology has shown that prolonged emotional stress can influence decision-making patterns so strongly that people begin to unconsciously choose options that maintain their current financial state, even when better opportunities are available. The mind protects familiarity more than it pursues growth. This is where realization starts to become uncomfortable, because it means that many financial patterns are not purely external. They are repeated internal states playing out again and again. The same anxiety before spending, the same hesitation before receiving, the same disbelief when something good appears too easily. Here is the truth nobody says out loud. You were never broken. You were never lost. You were always exactly where you needed to be. And yet there is a strange emotional contradiction that most people live inside. They say they want abundance, but their body reacts with tension when it gets close. They desire freedom, but feel safer inside limitation because it is familiar. That contradiction is not a flaw. It is conditioning. But once it is seen clearly, it becomes impossible to ignore, because suddenly the problem is not outside anymore. It is within the emotional signal being broadcast every single day without awareness. And that is when a deeper question starts to form. If emotional energy is shaping financial reality more than effort itself, then what happens when that energy is deliberately changed during the most powerful subconscious state of the day? And what begins on the very first night of doing that is not what anyone expects. The first night did not feel powerful at all. In fact, it felt almost pointless at the beginning, like nothing meaningful was really happening. There was no sign, no sensation, no dramatic shift that the mind could hold on to. Just silence, darkness, and the same familiar weight of thoughts that usually show up right before sleep. Do not skip this part, because this is where most people make the biggest mistake. They expect transformation to announce itself loudly, and when it does not, they assume nothing is working. At first there was skepticism again, that quiet voice that says this is too simple, this cannot possibly change anything real. But underneath that doubt, something else was present. A small willingness to continue anyway, not because of belief, but because of curiosity that had not fully disappeared. So the method began. No effort, no forcing. Just a gentle internal focus right before sleep, holding a simple emotional state connected to abundance and calm expectation. Not visualizing intensely, not trying to control outcomes, just staying in a subtle feeling of openness while drifting into sleep. Here is a lesser-known fact that gives this moment more meaning. During the transition into sleep, the brain naturally enters hypnagogia, a state where reality and imagination begin to overlap. In this phase, emotional impressions become stronger than logical thought, which means whatever feeling is present can leave a deeper imprint than during waking hours. Nothing dramatic happened that night. No sudden financial change. No external confirmation. If measured by ordinary standards, it looked like nothing at all had occurred. But internally, something was different in a way that was hard to explain. The usual tension around money felt slightly quieter. The constant background pressure did not disappear, but it was not as loud. There was a subtle sense of softness in the mind, like something had loosened without permission. It was not excitement yet, it was not belief either. It was something in between, a quiet space that had not been there before. And that is what made it confusing, because when nothing changes on the outside, but something shifts on the inside, the mind does not know whether to ignore it or pay attention to it. And what begins to happen over the next few nights makes that confusion even harder to explain. What if the most powerful moment for rewriting your entire financial reality is not during effort, but during sleep, when you are least aware of it? Do not skip this part, because this is where most people make the biggest mistake. They underestimate the mind at night, assuming rest means shutdown, when in reality, something far more active is happening beneath awareness. During sleep, the subconscious mind does not turn off. It becomes more dominant. The critical thinking layer of the brain, the part that questions and doubts, becomes quieter. This is why habits, fears, and even emotional patterns tend to repeat themselves over long periods without conscious effort. The mind is learning constantly, even in silence. Here is a lesser-known fact that shifts the entire understanding of this process. Studies in cognitive neuroscience have shown that memory consolidation is significantly enhanced during slow-wave sleep, meaning the brain actively strengthens emotional and experiential patterns during rest, not just during waking learning. In simple terms, what you feel repeatedly before sleep becomes more likely to shape long-term belief structures. This is where the idea of sleep programming begins to make sense without mystery. It is not about forcing outcomes or controlling reality. It is about repetition of emotional signals during a state where resistance is lowest. When the same feeling is experienced again and again before sleep, the subconscious begins to treat it as familiar truth. At this point, something often shifts in understanding, because suddenly it is not about belief anymore. It becomes about consistency of internal state. And that creates a strange sense of responsibility. Not in a stressful way, but in a reflective way. You start to realize that most people are not blocked by lack of opportunity, but by repeated emotional patterns that quietly reinforce limitation. And once that is seen clearly, it is impossible to ignore how often stress, worry, and doubt are the final feelings carried into sleep. And here is where it becomes even more interesting. If repetition shapes belief, and belief shapes perception, then what happens when repetition is deliberately aligned with a feeling of already having what is desired even before it exists externally? And what begins to emerge from that question in the next stage is something most people never expect to experience at all. Something unusual starts happening when repetition continues beyond the first night, not in the outer world immediately, but in the way reality begins to feel closer, softer, and less disconnected. Do not skip this part, because this is where most people make the biggest mistake. They assume change must be dramatic to be real, so they miss the quiet beginning of transformation when it first appears. By the second and third night, doubt does not disappear completely, but it starts to lose its authority. The mind no longer reacts as strongly to the idea. There is less resistance, less internal argument, and something subtle begins to replace it. A quiet curiosity that says, maybe this is not pointless after all. Small things start to happen during this phase. Not miracles, not sudden wealth, but unexpected moments that slightly shift attention. A delayed payment suddenly arrives without chasing. A small opportunity appears that was not being actively searched for. A conversation opens a door that seemed closed before. Here is a lesser-known fact that connects deeply to this stage. Research in behavioral psychology suggests that when emotional expectancy shifts even slightly, the brain begins to notice different patterns in the environment that were previously ignored. In simple terms, attention itself begins to filter reality differently based on internal state. That is where the real change starts to feel noticeable. Not because money has fully changed yet, but because perception of money begins to shift. It stops feeling like something far away and starts feeling like something that is already moving closer. There is a quiet emotional difference that appears around this stage. The pressure that used to sit in the background starts to loosen. Breathing feels less tied to urgency. Thoughts about money are still present, but they are no longer heavy in the same way. Here is the pattern interrupt that most people never expect. Here is the truth nobody says out loud. You were never broken, you were never lost. You were always exactly where you needed to be. And that realization begins to change how each night is approached. By the fourth and fifth night, something else starts to build underneath the surface. Not just belief, but anticipation. A subtle feeling that something is beginning to align, even if it cannot yet be explained logically. And what happens when that alignment deepens beyond expectation is something that completely changes the direction of everything that follows. Something changes in the energy around night 6 that is difficult to explain in logical terms, because nothing dramatic shifts outside first, yet everything inside begins to reorganize itself in a completely different direction. Do not skip this part, because this is where most people make the biggest mistake. They underestimate the moment where quiet belief starts turning into something stronger, something that begins to feel like inner certainty instead of hope. By this stage, the repetition is no longer being questioned. It is simply happening. The emotional state before sleep is no longer forced or analyzed. It begins to feel natural, almost automatic. And that is when something unexpected starts to emerge. A stronger sense of inner confidence appears, not the loud kind that needs validation, but a quiet, grounded feeling that things are no longer stuck in the same place. The mind starts reacting differently to financial thoughts. Less fear, less tension, more space. Here is a lesser-known fact that explains why this matters. In neuroscience, repeated emotional experiences can strengthen neural pathways through a process called synaptic reinforcement. When a thought is paired with emotion repeatedly, the brain begins to treat it as a stable pattern, reducing internal conflict around it over time. That is why something subtle but powerful begins to happen around nights 6 to 8. Decisions feel lighter. Thoughts about money feel less heavy. And instead of chasing outcomes mentally, there is a strange sense of being aligned with whatever is already unfolding. Opportunities do not arrive as dramatic events, but as natural openings. A message comes without expectation. A timing aligns without effort. A small idea appears that feels worth acting on without resistance. There is no forcing anymore, only response. And emotionally, this is where the biggest shift happens. The feeling of lack starts to lose its grip. It does not vanish completely, but it no longer defines the internal state. There is more stability, more trust in the process, even without full understanding. Here is the pattern interrupt that becomes undeniable at this stage. Here is the truth nobody says out loud. You were never broken. You were never lost. You were always exactly where you needed to be. And from this point forward, something begins to build that cannot be ignored anymore. Because the next night brings a shift that feels completely different from everything experienced so far. Something about the ninth night feels different even before anything happens, as if the inner system already knows a threshold has been crossed long before the outer world shows any evidence of it. Do not skip this part, because this is where most people make the biggest mistake. They think transformation is something that arrives suddenly from outside, when in reality it often begins as a silent internal confirmation that cannot be explained. On this night there is no effort anymore. No trying, no forcing. The practice has become part of the mind's rhythm. And then something unexpected begins to unfold in the days surrounding it. Something that does not feel like coincidence anymore. A financial shift appears, but not in a dramatic movie-like way. It may come as an opportunity that lands unexpectedly, a payment that resolves itself, or a situation that suddenly opens without struggle. But what makes it powerful is not the size of the change, but the feeling attached to it. Here is a lesser-known fact that connects deeply to this experience. Studies in cognitive identity research suggest that when repeated emotional states stabilize over time, the brain begins to update self-perception automatically, meaning people do not just change habits, they begin to unconsciously shift the identity they associate with themselves. That is why the ninth night does not feel like just another step. It feels like a crossing point. Something inside no longer identifies with the same version of struggle. Even if life is not perfect, the internal relationship with money begins to change permanently. There is a quiet realization that forms in this stage. It is not that something external finally fixed everything. It is that the internal state that used to create resistance is no longer the dominant frequency. And because of that, reality begins to respond differently without effort. And this is where the emotional awakening begins. Not excitement, not shock, but fulfillment mixed with disbelief. Because deep down there is recognition that something fundamental has shifted, and it is not going back to the old pattern again. Here is the pattern interrupt that becomes impossible to ignore at this stage. Here is the truth nobody says out loud. You were never broken, you were never lost, you were always exactly where you needed to be. And what happens after an identity begins to shift like this is something most people never prepare for. Because the real transformation is only just beginning to reveal itself. Something becomes clear only after the experience is lived fully, not during it, but after the mind stops trying to label it and simply observes what has already changed. Do not skip this part, because this is where most people make the biggest mistake. They keep searching for external explanations when the real shift has already happened internally. It was never just about money. That is the part that slowly reveals itself once the emotional noise settles. The real movement was happening in the internal state long before anything appeared in the outer world. Money was only the reflection, not the source. There is a deeper realization that begins to surface here. What actually changed was not effort, not timing, and not external conditions. It was the internal frequency that was being carried consistently into the subconscious mind before sleep. That state became the new baseline, and everything else adjusted around it. Here is a lesser-known fact that aligns with this understanding. In studies on embodied cognition, researchers have found that emotional states can influence perception of external reality so strongly that two people in identical situations can interpret outcomes completely differently based on internal mood and expectation patterns. That means reality is not just happening to people. It is being filtered through them. The emotional state acts like a lens, shaping what is noticed, what is ignored, and what is interpreted as possible. And this is where awakening begins to form, because once this is seen clearly, it becomes impossible to fully return to unconscious living. The idea that money is separate from internal states starts to collapse. It is no longer something outside to chase, but something inside to align with. Here is the pattern interrupt that lands differently at this stage. Here is the truth nobody says out loud. You were never broken. You were never lost. You were always exactly where you needed to be. And suddenly the question is no longer whether the method worked or not. The question becomes something much deeper about how reality itself has been responding all along, without being noticed. And what is revealed next challenges everything most people believe about effort, struggle, and receiving. Everything in this journey begins and ends in the same place. The internal state you carry when no one is watching, especially in the quiet moments before sleep when the mind stops pretending and simply becomes receptive. What started as curiosity slowly turned into doubt, then into small moments of awareness, and finally into something deeper that could not be ignored anymore. Not because life suddenly became perfect, but because the way life was being experienced started to change from the inside out. At first there was resistance. It felt too simple to matter. Then came hesitation, as if something this quiet could not possibly influence something as complex as money. But over time, repetition softened that resistance, and something unexpected began to happen. The emotional weight around money started to dissolve. The constant feeling of chasing began to lose its control, and in its place, a sense of alignment started to form. The real shift was never just about attracting money. It was about changing the frequency that was being lived in every single night, and allowing that frequency to become familiar enough for reality to respond differently. Because what the mind repeats in its most open state eventually becomes the identity it operates from. Here is a lesser-known fact that completes this understanding. In behavioral psychology, identity-based habits are considered far more powerful than goal-based actions, because once a person begins to see themselves differently, their decisions naturally adjust without conscious effort. That is why this was never just a method. It was a subtle internal reconditioning, a shift in how safety, abundance, and possibility were felt at the deepest level of awareness. Before you go, read this one last thing carefully. This might be the most important thing in this entire video. Change does not begin when the outside world moves. It begins when the internal story about what is possible finally shifts. Everything you just heard, you already knew. Deep inside, you just needed someone to remind you. And if even a small part of this message made something feel different inside, then do not ignore that feeling. It is not random, it is recognition. If you want more content like this, consider subscribing to the channel and liking the video. Not as a habit, but as a way of staying connected to ideas that challenge the way reality is normally understood. And if this message reached you at the right time, it may not be the last time you hear something like this.